story of the Buddha's life and talk about how this relates to our practice of breathing, and very specifically how it relates to three principal elements of Buddhist practice with which many of you are familiar. So, Buddhist practice is based on the teachings of the Buddha, and it can be divided into three areas of training, very significantly. The cultivation of attention, the cultivation of love, many different kinds of love, self-love, love for others, and the cultivation of wisdom. And the story of the Buddha is a way to introduce some of these elements of practice. And the very simple practices that we do here, becoming aware of our breath, that we do on Sunday mornings, are actually a way of furthering attention and compassion and wisdom. So how does that work, and how does this relate to the Buddhist story? One element of the Buddhist story with which you may be familiar is, he spends his life, his youth, in very luxurious surroundings. His father, the king, insists on this because he is prophesied to become either a very successful royal monarch or a very great spiritual practitioner. And his ambitious father, who is himself a king, wants his son to become a king too, and doesn't want him to have the kind of disappointments in life or recognition of the challenges of life that might lead him to spiritual endeavors, which is kind of how it works, right? Sometimes life hits us between the eyes in a certain way, and we start thinking there must be something else than worrying about my job and my finances and just fretting about everything. There must be something, some other way to live, some other way than trying desperately to hold on to some particular plan or some particular way that things should be or some particular sense of my own identity. And by the way, not worrying so much about other people because I'm too focused on myself. So the Buddha famously develops this wish to go out to a pleasure garden. And on the way, the gods arrange, so we are told, that he will encounter something that he's never encountered before, if you can believe it. He's 28 years old. And he sees first someone who's really old. And he is amazed. He says, "This man is weak and slight, his flesh and blood withered, his skin wrinkled. He walks in pain. Who is this person?" And of course, his charioteer says, yeah, this comes to everyone. Old age comes to everyone. It's a big truth, hard to swallow. And he says in some versions of the story, and in Keanu Reeves' The Little Buddha, he says, "Even me? This me too?" And we all say this. We don't know we say it. Don't you feel like you're kind of an exception? It's crazy, but we feel that way. So, his teacher, his charioteer, sent by the gods, says, everyone encounters this. And he meets also a very sick person, and finally he sees a corpse. When he sees the corpse, he's astonished. Death comes to everyone, then he's not going to fool around in the pleasure garden. He needs to reflect deeply on the meaning and purpose of his life. So in many ways, I think that Buddhism teaches what life teaches. If you live long enough, you realize that things change, that our bodies are frail, that we lose friends, loved ones. We're going to lose our own bodies, minds, lives as we know them. That's kind of a big deal. And an important principle that is really central to the way Buddhism talks about this is the ubiquity, the universality of this experience. And there's something very profound and perhaps even comforting about that. Famous story you may also know of Kisa Gotami, a young woman who married a rich person during the time of the Buddha and had an infant son whom she loved very, very much, of course. The child died when was still a toddler. She was desperate with grief. You can well imagine. She went to the Buddha. She said, "Please, my child, surely you can revive him. Please bring him back. It's unbearable to me. Why should he die at this? He's 2, 3 years old." And the Buddha's response is interesting. He says, "All right, I'll do what you ask if you can find me a mustard seed from a household in which no one has died." So she goes from house to house throughout the village and says, "Has anyone died in your family, in your household?" "Yes, my mother-in-law, my father, my brother, my cousin, my stillborn child." So she comes to the Buddha without the mustard seed and with the deep recognition that this is truly a universal experience. Buddhist teacher Christina Feldman, commenting on this story, made the lovely remarks, "We all walk on shifting sands. It's just the nature of things. And this challenge is not ours alone. And that has a kind of comfort to it. The story of our lives, inevitably mortal, inevitably subject to changes that we did not purposely arrange or plan for, is a story of everybody's life. Paying attention to this can further our compassion. There's a profound connection between paying attention, which is itself a form of caring, and the development of compassion. And this opens also to the wisdom of recognizing, one, that we're not alone, two, that we're not unique. I mean, all of our particular stories and the particular ways that we experience our lives and the challenges that we have, these certainly are unique. But as Christina Feldman also says, our unique story, our particular story, is part of this universal story. So we have a profoundly shared humanity. And this itself begins to loosen the tightness with which we hold on to a particular sense of identity, a particular sense of I and me and self, which, according to Buddhist understanding, is actually the source of our suffering. When we open up to recognize that our suffering teaches us how other people feel, which is simultaneously a way of connecting to others, a way of not feeling so alone, and a way of loosening somewhat the skein, as we often talk about. You know, we say that what we think of as a solid, independent self or identity that we have, when we look closely, is actually just made of many, many, it's like a ball of yarn. You know, it seems solid. You can roll it. You can throw it across the room. We'll have a big ball of yarn on Tuesday as part of our Losar New Year festivities. And it seems like it's one thing. But of course, if we pay attention, there's no ball there, really. There's just, individual strings, pieces of yarn, bits of yarn. This is very significant, very simple, but if we take it to its logical conclusion, a very, very significant insight for Buddhism. So what we're seeing is that that moment in the story of Shakyamuni Buddha, when he gets it, that things will change, that life is not a solid state situation. Life is, it's all moving parts. It's all moving parts. That's just the way it is. And it's not just our moving parts. It's everybody else's moving parts. And we're all kind of interlocking, inter-dancing moving parts. That's what the world is. And so we can have a sense of compassion. You can imagine the compassion that Kisa Gotami felt when she went and one after the other met people who, like her, had shared this terrible loss. And how painful it is. Didn't make her grief dry up and go away immediately, no doubt. But she came to the Buddha really a different woman. And she asked to be ordained. She now wanted to dedicate her life to practice because she had realized there was a kind of crack in the seamless horizon of her life as she had understood it until now, and as we understand it until something opens it, that there was something more to really contemplate and reflect on that was very, very significant. And that she could do it. We all have capacity for attention, compassion, and wisdom, don't you? You know something about what that is already. We're all set. You know how to pay attention. You drive, don't you? You have to pay attention. You engage in conversation, don't you? That takes some attention. You send emails. You know what attention is. And sometimes, certainly, your heart opens to the suffering of others, not just your own. Whether it's your children, your family, your pets, or just some horrific story, bodies washed up in grease, and you feel, oh, such terrible things people are experiencing right now. And that's very, very significant. To make the connection between our own pain and what other people feel is a profound human thing that we do naturally in life. As I said, Buddhism teaches what life teaches, but it tries to get us there before the end of our life when, things become rather clear. Another famous story about the Buddha. The Buddhist teachings developed really in dialogue with people. So Buddha didn't stand up and make a big speech about how there is, when Kisa Gotami came to him, he didn't say, oh, don't worry, this happens to everybody. He didn't say, don't grieve. He didn't even give her a discourse on impermanence. He just said, go, talk to people, see what their experience is. Very human kind of learning, right? Later, his first sermon was exactly about this. But it was in response to people's questioning in their own lives. So we're invited to question and quest in our own lives. And one lovely story that you may be familiar with, a very beautiful story of a king and queen at the time of the Buddha in India walking in the evening air. And the king says, when I think about all the people that there are throughout space, I realize that no one is more dear to me than myself. They're a very modern couple. They're having a very honest conversation. And the queen takes this in a deep way, and she says, it's me too. When I think about all the living people, all the people, everybody, no one's more dear to me than myself. I imagine them kind of looking at each other as, is this okay? So they go to the Buddha, and the Buddha says, in the chorus-like repetition manner of these kinds of texts, says, when I think about all the beings throughout space, I realize that no one is more dear to me than myself. But he doesn't stop there. He uses that as a way to recognize, he says, in exactly the same way is everyone else dear to themselves. It's a beautiful example, I feel, of something very important, of using our own experience to connect with what other people's experience is. So, you could go two ways, and we do. I think all of us do. I feel like I'm really important, or we don't even use those words. What do we obsess about most of the time when we're ruminating and worrying? It's mostly about us, or people very, very close to us. Sometimes we worry about big things like climate change, I hope. But so this recognition is, again, a source of compassion based on one's own experience. So how does this relate to our breath practices that we will do very shortly? When we pay attention to our breath, it's very clear that we are a process. We are a process. We pay attention to when breath begins, to its opening, to when it turns and we exhale. Paying attention allows us to be very clear about that. It cultivates attention, it brings us into the present. Because your breath is always in the present. And in the present is actually where we really seek to live. We don't. We think about the past. We try to lasso the past into the present. We try to leap from the present into the future to make sure that it's going to be all right. But did you ever leap into the future? Did you ever really bring the past? Of course, we have memories and we have plans, but we live in the present. That's the only place where we can actually experience what we are. So being attentive and being in the present is quite significant. And, as we've also said, attention opens up our experience to ourselves and then can open our hearts and sensitivities to others. And finally, as I mentioned, we see that the breath, what is the breath? Is that initial moment of breathing in what we call breath? It's part of what we call breath, but in itself, that very first moment, just when a little bit of air begins to enter. Now, when we say we're breathing, we don't just mean that. Do we mean the expanding of chest and heart, feeling the lungs fill up? Well, it's pretty important, but that alone is not what we mean by breathing. Or the exhale. So we have this inhalation, this kind of resting, bottom of the breath, and exhalation. And breath, if you think about it, is really just a word, a name that you put on top of those many, many moments of change, of processing in your body. That's an opening to wisdom. And we all have the capacity to experience this, recognize it, deepen it. We all have the potential that is harbinged in the line that I read when we started several Sundays ago, talking about the Buddhist story of the Buddha and how it illuminates the Buddhist teaching, you might remember living beings are like the sky. They are limitless. And then particularly this, every living being is in essence naturally luminous. This natural luminosity is a way of talking about our potential, our capacity, the quality of mind that we have. Mind is luminous, like a mirror. It can know, it can see. It's the quality of knowing that is native to our minds that's being pointed to here. And because of this potential that we have for attention, compassion, and wisdom, we have these various teachings and practices that can help us bring them to maturity. And that's why we do the practices that we do. Take a moment to see if anybody has a question that you must ask right now. We'll have a little time later also. You good? Attention, kindness, wisdom. This is what we're seeking to cultivate. We must do this because our life is not really opening to its full capacity of our natural luminosity if we don't make the most of these kinds of capacities that we have through cultivating these kinds of qualities. Okay, thank you. So take a little break, because relaxing is also very important. And 1 or 2 minutes, you can relax, stand up if you like, and then we'll begin our practice.